When Douglas MacArthur fled the Philippine Islands back in 1942, he made that famous promise about coming back. 3 years later, he meant to keep his word, and he wasn't about to waste any time doing it. The general had his eyes fixed on Manila, the capital city that held thousands of Allied prisoners behind enemy lines. But it wasn't just about rescue missions. MacArthur understood that getting Manila back would restore legitimacy to the Philippine government that had been sitting in exile all this time. The whole thing was personal for him, strategic for the war effort, and politically crucial for the future of the islands. The American military leadership wasn't exactly united on how to go about this operation, though. Walter Kruger commanded the Sixth Army, and he preferred playing it safe. His plan involved building up their strength at Lingayen Gulf first, making sure everything was solid and secure before they pushed inland toward the main island of Luzon. Kruger worried about Japanese units hiding up in the mountain ranges who could come down and hit their supply lines from behind if they moved too quickly. It made sense from a tactical standpoint. You don't want to charge forward and then find yourself cut off from reinforcements and ammunition. MacArthur saw things differently. Every day they waited meant another day the Japanese could spend wrecking Manila and killing prisoners. The general pushed for an immediate advance, figuring that maybe, just maybe, the enemy would declare Manila an open city and withdraw without fighting, the same way American forces had done when they couldn't hold it back in 1942. It was optimistic thinking, perhaps even wishful, but MacArthur had never been one to sit around when he thought action was needed. Over on the Japanese side, things were just as confused, maybe more so. General Tomoyuki Yamashita commanded the Japanese forces in the Philippines, and he knew perfectly well that trying to defend Manila would be suicide. The city was indefensible against American firepower. His plan made military sense. Pull back into the mountains up north, scatter the forces, and wage a guerrilla campaign that could tie down American troops for months or years. Yamashita issued clear orders. General Shizuo Yokoyama, who commanded the Shimbu Group, was supposed to evacuate Manila completely and take command of all naval forces in the area while pulling back. But the Navy had other ideas. Vice Admiral Denshiji Okochi countermanded those orders by sending different instructions to Rear Admiral Sanji Iwabuchi, who commanded the Manila Naval Defense Force. Okochi told Iwabuchi to hold the city no matter what. There were naval installations to protect, supplies to deny to the enemy, and pride to salvage. That last point mattered more than you might think. The Japanese Navy was still bitter about losing the battleship Kirishima at Guadalcanal, and they wanted revenge, wanted to prove something, wanted to go down fighting rather than retreating into the hills. Iwabuchi followed his naval superiors instead of the army's chain of command. Loyalty to the Navy trumped everything else. He scraped together about 17,000 men for his defense force, and it was quite a mixed bunch. Sailors from ships that had been sunk, Marines, mechanics, support personnel, even Korean and Taiwanese auxiliaries who'd been pressed into service, plus civilian workers who got caught up in the military machine. These men resolved to fight to the death, which sounds dramatic, but that's exactly what happened. The equipment situation was terrible. Iwabuchi's force didn't have proper tanks, no heavy artillery worth mentioning, and they were short on standard infantry weapons. So they improvised, and some of their improvisations were pretty creative in a grim sort of way. They stripped 990 machine guns right off aircraft, the 20mm type. They found 600 other machine guns from various sources. A handful of 120mm guns got positioned at key points. Naval bombs were converted into mines, and when they ran out of proper weapons, men fashioned spears by lashing bayonets onto poles. Imagine going into battle in 1945 with a spear against tanks and artillery. That's the kind of desperation we're talking about. The last day of January in 1945 saw MacArthur himself show up at the command post of the 1st Cavalry Division, which was stationed at a place called Linjan. He wanted them moving immediately. No delays, no excuses. Just after midnight, as February 1st began, the flying columns rolled out. These were fully motorized cavalry detachments, and they moved fast. They covered more than 100 miles of jungle terrain and mountain roads in just 66 hours, an incredible pace that brought them to Manila's outskirts before the Japanese quite realized what was happening. A few days later, the 37th Infantry Division also started their march toward the capital. Within days, those mechanized cavalry units were pushing into the outer districts of Manila. MacArthur laid out 3 urgent objectives for them. First, they needed to rescue the internees being held at Santo Tomas University. Second, they had to seize Malacanang Palace, the seat of government. Third, they needed to capture the legislative building. These weren't just symbolic targets. They represented actual control over the city's political infrastructure and the safety of thousands of prisoners. On the night of February 3rd, soldiers from the 8th Cavalry Regiment forced their way through the gates of Santo Tomas University. The guards on duty were mostly Taiwanese auxiliaries, and they barely put up a fight. Inside, around 3,500 prisoners had been held since 1942. Most were Americans, but there were British and Dutch internees too. When they saw their liberators coming through those gates, they broke down crying, hugging the soldiers, unable to believe it was really over. 3 years of captivity, malnutrition, disease, uncertainty about whether they'd ever see home again, and suddenly American troops were there. But it wasn't completely finished yet. 63 Japanese soldiers had barricaded themselves inside the main school building with 275 hostages. Nobody wanted to rush that situation and get people killed at the last minute. Negotiations dragged on through February 4th and into the 5th before those hostages finally got released. The whole thing could have gone terribly wrong, but patience paid off. Once everyone was out, the Americans faced a logistical nightmare. They had thousands of newly freed internees who desperately needed food, medical attention, and care. Meanwhile, the Japanese blew up the Novaliches Bridge, cutting off one of the main supply routes into the city. This left the 1st Cavalry Division running short on ammunition, fuel, and rations. They had to wait for the flames to die down before engineers could start assessing how to get supplies moving again. When the cavalry pushed deeper into the city along those narrow streets, they discovered just how thoroughly the Japanese had prepared their defences. Mines were buried everywhere. Barbed wire stretched across intersections. Trucks and debris blocked the roads. Machine gun positions were set up so they could cover each other with interlocking fields of fire. When the 148th Regiment tried to cross the Estero de la Reina Bridge heading toward the Pasig River, they ran straight into a trap. Mines went off, then 5 500-pound bombs that had been rigged on the bridge structure itself detonated. Fuel depots along the riverbank erupted in flames, and machine gun fire came pouring down from elevated positions. The Noguchi detachment of Japanese defenders had torched numerous buildings along the riverside and planted explosives in military facilities. The Americans had to pull back temporarily, just to fight the fires before they could think about advancing again. Meanwhile, civilians were flooding into the streets. Manila's residents came out to welcome the Americans, showering them with gifts and praise, thanking them for liberation. But some people also took advantage of the chaos to loot stores and homes, which created confusion that sometimes made it harder for military operations to proceed smoothly. Liberation brought its own kind of disorder. By February 7th, American forces controlled almost everything north of the Pasig River. The Japanese who survived pulled back to the southern bank of the river and proceeded to demolish all 6 bridges that connected the 2 halves of the city. This made the American advance considerably more complicated. Lieutenant General Oscar Griswold commanded the 14th Corps, and he ordered the 37th Division to expand eastward while the 1st Cavalry Division swung around to the east and south in a big arc, encircling the city from multiple directions. That same day, the 148th and 129th Regiments of the 37th started crossing the Pasig in engineer boats and amphibious vehicles. The first wave made it across without too much trouble, but when the second wave started coming over, Japanese machine gunners on the south bank opened up. Oars splintered and shattered. Some soldiers had to paddle with their rifle butts, others used their bare hands to get to shore. They landed at the Malacanang Gardens, which happened to be the only stretch of riverbank without high embankments that would have made landing impossible. They established a towhold, a bridgehead that could be expanded. The next day, Army engineers managed to construct a 2-lane pontoon bridge to replace the destroyed Quezon Bridge. As soon as it was up, hundreds of civilians came rushing across, fleeing the fighting in the southern districts. The bridge got completely jammed with refugees, which caused severe congestion and made it nearly impossible for military vehicles to get through. When the 37th Division finally got across the river in force, they found themselves facing the dense industrial and residential blocks south of the Pasig, where the Japanese had converted sturdy concrete buildings into fortresses. On Provisor Island sat the steam power plant, a massive structure of steel and stone that the Japanese had turned into a strongpoint with sandbag bunkers and machine gun nests covering every approach. American troops had to row across under heavy fire, then storm through dark, smoke-filled rooms while generators roared in the background. Hand-to-hand fighting broke out in the corridors. It took 2 full days of bloody combat and cost 25 American lives before that power plant was finally secured. Pushing forward from there, the 148th Regiment swept through Pandacan district with relatively little resistance, but when they reached Paco railway station, they hit a brick wall. The Japanese had turned every part of that station into a death trap. The railway tracks, the platforms, the walls, everything had been fortified. 20mm guns covered every corner from reinforced concrete bunkers. Slit trenches zigzagged through the area. Even the church bell tower nearby had been turned into an observation post for directing fire. American infantry had to advance yard by yard, crawling under fire, shooting bazookas through walls, then charging forward under covering fire from their own machine guns and mortars. They made 10 separate assaults through clouds of dust and smoke before Paco Station finally fell at 8:45 in the morning on February 10th. The cost was brutal. 45 men killed and 307 wounded in just 2 days of fighting over one railway station. From that point forward, the battle turned into a slow, grinding fight for individual strongpoints throughout the urban landscape. Every block became a fortress, every building a potential death trap. MacArthur had initially restricted artillery fire because he wanted to preserve the city, ordering that guns could only fire at targets that had been directly observed and identified. But as casualties mounted and the pace of advance slowed to a crawl, that restriction got lifted on February 10th. After that, American artillery hammered away with 105mm and 155mm guns, supported by tanks rolling up to blast walls at point-blank range and flamethrowers burning out defensive positions. The infantry would storm a building, often get thrown back by Japanese defenders, then call in more artillery and attack again. Sometimes they'd have to do this multiple times before a single structure fell. The new police station complex on Marqués de Camilla Street presented a particularly nasty problem. The Japanese had fortified not just the police headquarters, but also a shoe factory, a club building, and a school, turning the entire complex into one massive interconnected bastion. It took 8 days of brutal fighting to clear that place. Fresh regiments had to be rotated in, tanks charged straight at the walls, flamethrowers sprayed fire through windows and doors, phosphorus grenades sent burning white smoke through the rooms, artillery shells crashed through the ceilings. And still they had to clear it room by room, floor by floor, until finally the last defenders were dead. While the 37th Division fought that building-to-building battle, the 1st Cavalry Division executed a wide encirclement maneuver, essentially laying siege to the southern and eastern parts of Manila like armies used to do with medieval cities. On February 8th, the 8th and 5th Cavalry Regiments crossed the river east and south of the city centre. The 8th took a more direct route while the 5th swung way out through Makati. They encountered scattered resistance but captured the Makati power station on February 10th, which was important because Kruger's policy emphasized preserving infrastructure that the Philippines would need after the war. By February 12th, Both regiments had reached the coastline, completing the encirclement, sealing the ring around the Japanese defenders. Then they turned north along Manila Bay to link up with the 37th Division pushing south. Along the way, they hit more strong points at Harrison Park, Rizal Stadium, and La Salle University. The Japanese had dug bunkers right into the baseball field at the stadium, which meant the Americans had to flush them out with flamethrowers, explosives, and tanks grinding across what used to be the outfield. On February 16th, the 1st Cavalry Brigade, which consisted of the 5th and 12th Regiments, got detached from the division and sent to reinforce the 37th in the downtown fighting. They advanced on the Manila Hotel and the High Commissioner's residence, which happened to be MacArthur's former home from before the war. They fought room by room through these buildings, while MacArthur himself showed up in the rubble to encourage his soldiers, which was either inspiring or reckless, depending on your perspective. Up in the northern part of the city, the 37th Division had cleared most of the Japanese resistance by mid-February. On February 19th, the exhausted 148th Regiment got relieved by the 5th Cavalry, which then pushed into the University of the Philippines Hospital. The Japanese had converted that medical facility into a nightmare of defensive positions. Bunkers in the basement, loopholes cut through walls, machine guns on the rooftops, interlocking fields of fire through the corridors. After days of combat that reduced parts of the hospital to rubble, only 75 of the original 250 defenders remained alive, and they committed suicide on the night of February 23rd rather than surrender. More than 7,000 patients and civilians had been trapped inside that hospital throughout the fighting, and they were finally rescued. With the outer ring of the city sealed off and most districts cleared, the Japanese fell back to their final defensive position in Intramuros, the old walled city that the Spanish had built centuries ago. Those stone ramparts stood 40 feet thick in places, massive walls that had been built to withstand cannon fire back in the age of sail. Starting on February 17th, American heavy artillery pounded those walls around the clock. By the morning of February 23rd, more than 7,400 shells had been fired at Intramuros from 105mm guns, 155mm howitzers, 75mm pack guns, 4.2-inch mortars, and even 8-inch guns. They blasted gaps through those ancient walls. 10 minutes after the artillery barrage stopped, smoke screens were laid down to cover the assault. The 129th Regiment crossed the Pasig in engineer boats to attack from the north side, while the 145th Regiment breached the eastern walls. With so many machine gun nests already destroyed by artillery, the initial progress was quick. But then waves of refugees came flooding into the streets, creating chaos. More than 2,000 women and children had been herded by Japanese troops into the Delmonico Church and hadn't been evacuated yet. Supply troops rushed trucks forward to carry them to safety behind American lines. The men, however, got separated from their families and were marched into Fort Santiago, where they were executed en masse. It was one of many atrocities that marked these final days of fighting. Inside Intramuros, the 129th and 145th Regiments advanced street by street through narrow lanes that turned into gauntlets of hidden positions and booby traps. In the northwest corner stood Fort Santiago, which had served as a prison under Spanish colonial rule. The national hero José Rizal had been held there before his execution. Now the Japanese had turned it into a dark maze of cells and tunnels. American troops had to pour gasoline and oil through ventilation shafts, then throw phosphorus grenades down to ignite it, then sweep through with flamethrowers to root out defenders who were still alive. Flames licked up the moss-covered stone walls, while smoke made it almost impossible to see or breathe. After clearing cell blocks and underground passages one section at a time, they reported Fort Santiago secured by midday on February 25th. Some Japanese soldiers tried to disguise themselves by putting on American uniforms and carrying M1 rifles, hoping to infiltrate or escape. Others raised white flags from places like the Delmonico Church bell tower, then opened fire again when Americans approached, thinking it was a surrender. None of those tactics worked for long. None of those defenders survived. Only 25 Taiwanese troops decided to surrender during the entire battle for Intramuros. At dawn on February 26th, with the walled city lost and American troops closing in, Rear Admiral Iwabuchi and his staff committed suicide inside the agriculture building rather than face capture. But even though Intramuros had fallen, 3 massive concrete government buildings still held out. The Legislative Building, the Finance Building, and the Agriculture Building were the final bastions of Japanese resistance in Manila. Anticipating that the Americans would assault from the south, Iwabuchi had heavily reinforced all 3 structures before his death. Machine guns covered every window. Basements were filled with sandbags. Bunkers had been built into the foundations. On February 25th, the 37th Division's artillery unleashed a concentrated barrage against these buildings, but some rounds overshot their targets and fell among the 1st Cavalry Division positions near the bay, forcing them to pause and readjust their fire. The next day, February 26th, the 148th Regiment stormed the Legislative Building, but Japanese defenders inside hurled grenades through holes they'd cut in the floors, raining explosives down on the Americans, forcing them to withdraw and call for more bombardment. It wasn't until February 28th that the Legislative Building was finally taken. Meanwhile, the 5th Cavalry assaulted the Agriculture Building, but got pinned down by fire coming from the nearby San Luis Terrace apartments, which the Japanese were using as a supporting position. They had to clear that apartment complex first before they could return their attention to the main target. On February 28th, 155mm guns were brought up to fire point blank at the Agriculture Building, while American tanks ground forward right up against the base of the structure, firing their main guns directly into the lower levels at almost zero range. Flamethrowers, bazookas, and phosphorus grenades burned out the machine gun nests. Interior walls collapsed, floors buckled. On March 1st, the Americans called for the defenders to surrender, but silence was the only response. So they responded with more fire, more fuel, more explosives, methodically collapsing the building piece by piece, floor by floor. 2 days later, after yet another artillery barrage, the 148th Regiment stormed the Finance Building and wiped out the last Japanese holdouts who were making a final stand in the elevator shaft. By dawn on March 3rd, it was over. That afternoon, General Griswold sent a signal to General Kruger with simple words. All resistance has ended. The Battle of Manila was officially over. But the true horror of those 3 weeks wasn't just the military casualties or the tactical fighting. As the battle raged through the city streets, Japanese naval troops, undisciplined and desperate and furious at their impending defeat, turned their fury on Filipino civilians. Districts like Tondo, Binondo, and Paco were deliberately set on fire. Women and children were herded into churches and schools, then burned alive or blown apart with hand grenades. Men were slaughtered in backyards, in garbage pits, along riverbanks. Survivor diaries and testimonies tell of hundreds of people burned alive in theatres, in Bayview Cathedral, at St. Paul's School. Families crawled into sewers, pushing their children through narrow cracks in the walls, desperate to find any place to hide from the killing. At the home of the Quirino family, Japanese soldiers murdered the wife and 3 children of politician Manuel Roxas, who would later become president of the Philippines. He was forced to watch, screaming helplessly as his family died. A witness named Lourdes Reyes recalled seeing civilians dragged to the Pasig River, their throats cut, bodies pushed into the current to float away. Others hiding in the Bayview Hotel suffered gang rape before being killed. And as American artillery widened its bombardment to support the infantry advance, civilians trapped in air raid shelters were crushed or burned alive by shells that didn't distinguish between military and civilian targets. Afterward, American military estimates concluded that the majority of civilian deaths resulted from deliberate Japanese massacres, but they also acknowledged that their own artillery fire had inflicted heavy losses on the civilian population trapped in the combat zones. War doesn't pause to count casualties carefully or separate combatants from innocents when shells are falling. By March 3, 1945, Manila had been reduced to a shattered ruin. 3 weeks of intense urban combat cost the Americans 1,010 killed and 5,565 wounded. The Japanese garrison was virtually annihilated, with 16,665 confirmed dead. But the heaviest toll by far was borne by Filipino civilians. 100,000 lives lost, making the Battle of Manila one of the worst urban disasters of the entire Second World War, comparable to the destruction of Warsaw or the bombing of Dresden in terms of civilian casualties. The American artillery that protected their advancing soldiers from Japanese fire also reduced the ancient district of Intramuros to rubble. Buildings that had stood for centuries were gone. Water systems, electrical grids, and transportation infrastructure were ruined. Hospitals, schools, universities, churches, and entire neighborhoods lay in ruins. After the guns fell silent, American forces had to shift from combat operations to military administration. They rebuilt temporary bridges, cleared mines and booby traps from streets and buildings, posted guards to prevent looting, and tried to restore some semblance of order to a traumatized city. American soldiers, though they were treated to films, dances, and hot meals as reward for their service, still faced the grim reality of occupying a city scarred by disease, destruction, and haunting memories that would never fully fade. From a military perspective, the battle revealed the overwhelming power of combined arms warfare in an urban environment. Even without air support operating inside the city itself, where the risk of hitting friendly forces was too great, the Americans had ample artillery, tanks, flamethrowers, and most importantly, excellent coordination between different units and weapon systems. Once MacArthur lifted the restrictions on artillery fire and allowed commanders to use all available firepower, American forces learned to systematically level each block before advancing into it with infantry, which steadily reduced their casualty rates from an average of 26 deaths per day in the opening phase down to just 6 per day by the end of February. The Japanese defenders, by contrast, lacked artillery support, had no tanks, possessed minimal communications equipment, and had no air support whatsoever. All they had left was sheer willpower, determination to fight to the death, and the urban terrain itself. Foxholes dug into street corners, mines laid in stairwells, machine guns positioned in windows with interlocking fields of fire, and an absolute determination to fight for every room, every floor, every building until death. But such tenacity, however admirable or tragic depending on your view, could not withstand overwhelming firepower combined with encirclement that cut off all hope of reinforcement or resupply. The mathematics of attrition warfare were brutally simple. The Americans could replace losses, the Japanese could not. The Americans had unlimited ammunition, the Japanese did not. The Americans could rotate exhausted units out of combat, the Japanese had nowhere to go. The Battle of Manila marked the first and only time during the Pacific War that American forces had to storm a major city held by determined defenders. Island-hopping campaigns had involved brutal fighting, but never before through miles of urban streets and hundreds of buildings. The liberation of Manila paved the way for the eventual recapture of all of Luzon and ultimately the Philippines, but it also exposed the brutal cost that urban warfare imposes on civilian populations caught in the crossfire. In that kind of fighting, every house can become a fortress, and every family can become a victim. There's no front line, no safe area, nowhere to escape when the battle comes to your neighborhood, your street, your home. The firestorm that consumed Manila in February and early March of 1945 destroyed not only the city's historic Spanish walls and colonial architecture, but also consumed the memories and lives of an entire generation. It stands as a stark warning to posterity about the unparalleled devastation that occurs when modern warfare enters an urban environment where millions of civilians live. The lesson, if there is one to be drawn from such tragedy, is that peace and human life must be cherished and protected at all costs, because once lost in the chaos of urban combat, they can never truly be recovered. The scars remain, both physical and psychological, for generations. Manila would eventually be rebuilt, but the city that emerged from the ruins was not quite the same as the Pearl of the Orient that had existed before the war. Something irreplaceable had been lost in those 3 weeks of fire and blood and destruction, something that could never be fully restored, no matter how many buildings were reconstructed or streets repaved. The human cost alone ensured that Manila would forever carry the weight of February 1945, when liberation came at a price almost too terrible to calculate.